Hello and welcome to Rotary Rocketry. I'm back today with my P1 rocket. We're going to be taking a look at the damage caused by the maiden voyage of this rocket, and we'll be looking into making some repairs and getting it ready for a second launch. Now, if you haven't seen the first launch of this rocket, here's a quick shot of that video. The launch was fantastic, but because of an error I made when packing the parachute didn't fully deploy and the rocket came down a little faster than it was supposed to. When it hit the ground, well, this is the damage that we got. It's not too bad, but definitely needs some repairs before we can launch this again. So first off, what went wrong with the parachute? Well, it was completely my fault. When I detangled the lines and got the parachute ready for launch, I only attached 6 out of the 8 shroud lines to the central mounting point. So when the parachute deployed, one side of the parachute was loose and was able to kind of flip up a little bit, so the parachute just didn't deploy properly and the rocket came down just a little bit faster than expected. Now, to be completely honest, I think even if that parachute had deployed properly, we were still always going to break at least one fin pod on the landing. You see, we used Estes tubing. It's nice and rigid and holds its shape very well. It also has a really nice exterior finish, but it is thin wall. And for a rocket of this weight to come down and land just on one corner of one of these tubes, it's just too much for this to handle. Now, before we look into repairing this, just a couple of thoughts on how this probably could have been constructed a little bit better to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Now, if I wanted to stay with the thin wall Estes tubing, probably a couple of ideas there. First off, I could have glued in some strips of wood or MDF on the inside just to make some reinforcing ribs on the lower section of the tube. That probably would have been enough reinforcing to stop that from happening. Another option, again staying with the thin wall tubing, would be to take a short section of tubing and cut a strip in that so that it can go smaller and fit inside of the tubing. That would provide 2 layers of tubing, and that would be significantly stronger because not only would you have the strength of the 2 layers of tube, but you'd also have the additional strength of the adhesive used to bond those together. A third option would have been just simply to switch to a more stronger tubing. You see, for the body tubes, we use a cardboard shipping tube, whether it's 2-inch, 3-inch, or 4-inch. But the smallest diameter I could find of that type of shipping tube was 1.5 inches. And for the style I was going for on this rocket, I was really looking for 1 inch. But 1.5 inches wouldn't have been that bad. It certainly would have looked nice and it would have been significantly stronger. So that certainly would have been a good option to use instead of the thin wall tubing. So let's take a look at repairing this. Now, the damage is pretty jagged along the edge, and then over on one side it's just buckled in. I've got a couple of ideas on making the repairs. The first one I want to try is simply to cut off this damaged section, see if I can kind of straighten out the cardboard, maybe put a little reinforcing sleeve on the inside using a piece of the same tubing, and then gluing that back together. Because with the jagged edge, if I can just reuse the same parts, they should basically fit back together. Little bit of patchwork with some adhesive and then paint touch up and it would look fine. If it's not really fixable because the tubing is just way too crumpled, then looking at possibly cutting a straight line across here and just removing about 3 inches of the entire tube and replacing that with a new section. The last option would be to completely detach this from the fin and make an entire new pod. That's a little bit more work than I was hoping for the repair, but it certainly is an option. So I'll start out by just using an X-Acto knife to cut out the damaged section below the fin. There is some adhesive here from where it was attached to that little leg on the fin. Makes this a little bit difficult to cut through. And there's the damaged part. Now, on one side, the damage really isn't that bad. It's just that the tube ripped apart. The real damage is on the other side where the tube crumpled. And I think the only way that we're going to reinforce that and get it to be nice and straight again is by making a sleeve with some of the original tubing that fits inside of this piece. This 3-inch portion of tubing should be all I need to reinforce the damaged section and leave enough to go back up into the other section of the tube to join them back together. I'll use this board to help me make a nice straight line down the tubing, and then I'll just cut out along that line. Now I just need to remove a small section so that this can go a little bit smaller and fit as a sleeve inside. So I'll just go right beside that, maybe about 1/8 of an inch or so, and we'll start with that. We can always cut off more. Let's see if that fits into a piece of the Estes tubing. Now, not quite, so I'll just cut off a little bit more. And that fits in good as a sleeve. I'm going to use construction adhesive to bond these two parts together. Now this particular brand of construction adhesive expands a little bit as it dries, so that's a good thing here because that'll help fill in any little gaps that there may be between the two parts. And then I'm going to put a rubber band around the damaged area here just to help keep that compressed, to keep the two parts together while that adhesive dries. We'll give that a few hours to dry.
Later.
Well, let's see how that came out. Well, that looks really nice. Surface is a little uneven. There's a little high spot right here. I'm just going to take that out to the shop and give it a little sanding just to even out the surface. That came out really nice. Now, I also cut some slots so that the coupler tube will fit over the fin and the glue that are already in the upper section of the pod. And that fits together great. I'll get that glued in place.
Later.
Now that that adhesive is dry, I'm just going to use some glue to help seal any tiny gaps in the repair. The glue will also seal down any open fibers of the cardboard tube, making a nice smooth surface for the paint. A light sanding, and it's ready for paint. Now that repair came out looking really nice. From a couple feet away, you can't even tell which one it is. It's this one, by the way. Now I put a little bit of extra time and effort into that because I really like this rocket and I wanted it to look nice. Now this pod is now stronger than the other three because of that repair, and you might be thinking, well, if we launch this again and it lands on one of the other three, it's just going to break one of them. Well, the plan is the next launch we do with this, we're going to launch it with our 6.5-foot diameter parachute. Now we've launched a similar size and weight rocket with the 6.5-foot parachute, and the descent rate is extremely slow with that parachute. So slow that actually I think there's a good chance that I'll be able to catch this rocket before it even hits the ground. But if it does hit the ground, it's going to be moving really slow. And if I do end up breaking a pod, well, I'll fix that when I get to it. Speaking of launches, let's go ahead and launch this right now. All right, we're out here today for the second launch of our P1 rocket. We'll be launching this with our SuperMonkey rocket motor. This is a PVC case motor filled with Flexi Fuel sugar fuel. And then for the descent, we'll be using a 6.5-foot Temu parachute. Now this is much larger of a parachute than what's required for this rocket, so the descent rate should be super slow. Hopefully I'll be able to catch it and prevent any damage to the fin pods. Now I have had some people ask if we're going to release some of the 3D print files from making the parts for some of our rockets. I'm planning on doing a little bit more of that in the future, but not for this specific rocket, because the defect with the fin pods, and you take the risk of breaking a fin pod anytime this rocket lands. So I am planning on doing an upgraded version of this, probably the P2 rocket, that'll have some much larger fin pods. And if we do that and it's successful, then I'll release the files for that one. Now, we also have some tutorial videos for how to make the rocket motor, the parachute, the flight computer, as well as the ejection charge. This will also be the first test of our new improved ejection charge design, so this will be really neat to see that in action. Let's go launch a rocket. Three, two, one. Well, it says 1,072 feet, another fantastic launch for this rocket. Hey, don't forget to check out the full line of Rotary Rocketry t-shirts and hoodies with a variety of fantastic graphics. There's a link to our shop down in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.